My definition of unconditional self-worth is believing you deserve to be alive, to be loved and cared for, and take up space just because you're human. And so often high achievers have high self-esteem, right? They have confidence that they can do the job and do the job well. But the way they treat themselves in the process and how they feel about themselves if something does not go right, if they lose a job or whatever, is indicative of their self-worth.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today, we talk about worthiness. Worthiness and the lack of it is something that's been a primary part of my struggles to start sharing more of my thoughts and beliefs, to allow myself to assume a leadership role in business and in other areas, and to search for an enduring romantic relationship. Lack of worthiness seems to be at the root of perfectionism, workaholism, fear of failure, and fear of success. It's often the stumbling block in feeling a sense of well-being and belonging with others. The topic of worthiness is really hard to unpack, or it was for me, because it is distinct from self-confidence. Throughout most of my life, I've been fairly confident in my abilities to do things or figure them out. In fact, I think too often I used confidence as a way to escape the fact that I didn't like myself that much. It is only in my late 30s and early 40s that I feel my sense of self-worth is starting to catch up to my sense of confidence. Worthiness is also one of these foundational topics that seems connected to almost everything in the world that I care about. It's at the core of belonging and othering, political inclusion or exclusion, status and privilege in society, religious and political extremism, online trolling, sexism, good and bad leadership, and the global decline of democracy. That's why I'm so happy to be talking to Dr. Adia Gooden today. Adia is a clinical psychologist and a TED speaker who works in the area of unconditional self-worth and helps people to embrace it. Adia is also an author and the host of her very own podcast called Unconditionally Worthy. Adia gained her bachelor's at Stanford and her PhD at DePaul University, and worked at the Counseling Center of University of Chicago. Today, she works as a speaker and coach, and is working on a new book in the making about the mental health of Black women. I spoke to Adia in early November, and I was excited to talk to her since I saw her powerful TED Talk on the subject of worthiness. Adia is an energizing and empowering speaker, so it was a joy to chat with her and hear her insights, as well as practical advice that can help us feel better about ourselves. We spoke about what growing up feeling lonely as a child instilled in her. What's wrong with trying to be perfect? What is worthiness and how self-worth is different from self-confidence? Why is worthiness important? The rise of depression and anxiety. The effects of COVID as well as social media and phone addiction. How to systematically improve our self-worth. What does the journey of self-worth look like? What's an imposter syndrome, and is it good or bad for us? How are worthiness and spirituality connected? What's the connection between worthiness and human dignity? And how she'd like to change the narrative of Black women's mental health in the US. What stayed with me from this conversation is how relatively straightforward and systematic our approach to self-worthiness can be. Following a relatively simple formula of self-forgiveness and acceptance, we can confront our feelings of unworthiness and start building a stronger foundation. And the effects of that can cascade throughout our lives, whether it's our professional lives, our family life, our relationships, and how we feel moment to moment. This conversation is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with hackers, designers, thinkers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, and activists who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Dr. Adia Gooden. All right. I'm sitting here with Dr. Adia Gooden. Adia, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'd love to start the way we usually start by checking in with just daily life and what is it like to be you these days in the world?
That is a good question. So I have 5.5-month-old, almost 6-month-old. She wakes up around 6. So that means I got to wake up around 6. And we spend the morning together, which is really fun, nursing and playing music and things like that. And then our nanny comes around 8. And then I usually work out or shower, meditate, make breakfast, eat breakfast, and then I start working. And that's, a combination of things. So I might be writing an email. I might be recording a podcast for my podcast. I might be in a meeting. I might be on a group coaching call. And then I stop work around 4, which is when our nanny leaves. We're playing with my daughter. It's been unseasonably warm in Chicago, so we go on some walks, which is nice. And my husband comes home pretty soon after that. We hang out. We put her to bed around 6:30. And then I'm cooking, eating, spending time with my husband, pumping. And then I usually get to bed around 10, wake up in the middle of the night for a night feed. And then we start over again at 6 a.m.
Nice. Whenever someone says they have a newborn baby, I don't know just to say congratulations or condolences or
it's a congratulations for me.
Good.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it. It's challenging, but I'm enjoying it.
That's wonderful. And so, this connects us with our official opening question, which takes us back to childhood. And it's what's something that you've learned in childhood or early in life that still drives or guides you today?
I don't know if it is exactly something I learned. I think in some ways it's something I learned, and in some ways it's something I experienced. So I learned that all people should have access to justice, to resources, right? To rights. And my parents communicated that to me. Both of them were sort of involved in the civil rights movement. And so I learned that. And then I also experienced feeling left out, feeling different, feeling lonely. And so I think that combination of a real strong belief in equality and equity and human rights, along with my own somewhat painful experiences of not being included and feeling different and not feeling valued and worthy, really drive me to both want everyone to believe that they are worthy and to support and help create a society that embraces the fact that everyone is worthy and treats everyone as worthy and gives everyone human rights and access to resources and water and food and all of those good things. I think that continues to drive me today.
So you grew up in Pasadena near Los Angeles, right? And tell me, what was that like to grow up in that environment for you and that home versus school? What was the experience of it like?
So Pasadena is a lovely place. And, I had a lovely upbringing. We lived in a nice house. My parents were together. They're still together. I think the challenges that I had at home were that I felt lonely. My parents are both introverts. They're, pretty intellectual. And so even as a kid, I felt like I needed to get up to their level in some ways. I grew up as an only child, so there wasn't a lot of like other kids to play with on a day-to-day basis. There were people on my block and invited friends over, so I had friends, but it was a little bit lonely. And then school, I also had a lot of privilege related to school. So I went to a private school. It's what I call a hippie elementary school because we didn't get grades and we called our teachers by their first names and we went on camping trips every year. And we had super small classes. So school, at least when I was really young, was an incredibly supportive space where I felt like I could learn and grow and wasn't judged. The friendship piece started to feel a little icky when like there were 20 people in our class and 18 people got invited to a birthday party and I was one of the 2 who didn't. Like that didn't feel good. 7th, 8th grade is when I started to feel like I wasn't part of the cool kids. I wasn't included. And so I had this sort of sense both at school that I wasn't totally included. Like the person who had been my best friend was pulling away from me and getting close to other people. At home, you know, there was sort of like my parents and then me. And then I went to a church where I was also sort of different. And so there were all these sort of spaces and places where even though on the surface I was really welcome, it felt like a deeper sense of like, I wasn't totally included and I wasn't the same as everyone else.
And so you said in your talk that around age 12, you decided that the solution to all of that was to be perfect. So, you know, what does it mean to be perfect and what's wrong with that?
I mean, I think when we make up in our heads that we want things to be perfect, it's no mistakes, no failures, never doing anything wrong, never getting anything wrong. And I think an aspect of that is like no learning, right? You should already know. You shouldn't have to learn anything because you should already know. And it's also a performance mode, right? Let me prove to people that I'm good enough, that I'm perfect, that I'm worthy. Let me prove it versus, okay, this is a process I'm experiencing, I'm adjusting, I'm iterating, right? All of those things I'm sure that are relevant to design, right?
For sure.
That perfection is like, you're supposed to get it right on the first try, right? Like the first try. And if you don't get it right on the first try, maybe you should give up because you're not good at it. Maybe you should stop, right? There's not a tolerance for the messy middle and the learning. And so I think in my description, I'm also sharing why it's problematic, right? Because we, I think, operate best as humans when we allow ourselves to learn and grow over time, when we allow ourselves to evolve. And a necessary part of learning is not knowing and is figuring it out. And sometimes that's trial and error. And sometimes that's, I don't know how to do this. Let me try this out and it doesn't work, or let me iterate, or this is a pretty good way to do it, but then I get more feedback and I realize I can improve it, right? Nothing we do is perfect on the first try. And when we hold ourselves to that standard, you know, we usually don't really engage in the process to get to, you know, max out our potential. And it also means that things are less fun when they need to be perfect, right? Yeah. When you have an intention and you're process oriented, it's usually easier to have fun. But when it has to be perfect, it's stressful, it's anxiety provoking. And it's usually like, how do I just get to the finish line so I can be done with this? Versus like, how do we play in the process of this?
Yeah, that's such a great answer. So when I COVID started learning the violin, and everybody says to me, oh, it must be so hard. It must be so hard. And I was like, it's only hard if you expect yourself to be good when you just started, right? If you're like, if you expect yourself to suck, then you're exactly where you need to be, and it's not that hard.
Yeah,
that's a lovely thing. So how do you move from becoming a perfect little girl? How does it lead you to college and to what you ended up studying?
Yeah, so I decided, around 12, I was like, okay, be the perfect friend, be the perfect student, do those things. I am blessed, lucky, privileged to be able to succeed academically, right? Like school is a place where I'm like, okay, great. I know the rules. I can follow the rules. I can get the grade. I can do the thing, right? That is a space that came easily to me. And so, you know, I went to high school, did well, went to Stanford. You know, that was obviously like a big accomplishment. Getting into Stanford was a big deal, but it still didn't make me feel worthy enough. So then I had to do all of the activities, right? And like, when I look back on my college experience, it was amazing. I loved it. And I wish I could tell my younger self, like, lighten up, like have a little bit more fun, go to more parties, right? Relax a little bit more. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because I was serious. Like I was going to get my homework done and I was going to do the activities and I would skip the parties. I didn't skip all the parties, let's be honest, but it was serious business. And I knew that I wanted to major in psychology because I still had that, piece from when I was growing up of being curious about people, being interested in people, wanting to understand how people tick and why they do the things they do. And so I majored in psychology, and Stanford had at least at that time, one of the top psychology departments in the country. So some really big players in the social psychology world. So it was really cool to be able to learn from them. And so I ended up deciding to sort of follow exactly in my parents' footsteps, which now, like seeing it, I can see that there's probably more to that than just my interest in psychology. But I ended up applying to PhD programs in clinical community psychology because that was another way for me to learn about people and help people. And then was off pretty quickly after graduating from college to doing a PhD program. And I think some of that was also feeding into the let's prove I'm worthy. Let's try to be perfect, right? No gaps in school, no breaks, right? There's no breaks. There's no time for rest. Let's go straight to school. And I think there's also elements for me of my parents are really impressive. Both of them have PhDs. And I at least need to do what they did, or I at least need to kind of live up to this standard that they have set. They didn't tell me I had to do that. That was never an explicit thing. But I think I made up that was also another way to prove that I was worthy.
That's really interesting and feels familiar. In the Jewish mother's lexicon, like there's this word potential. You have so much potential and you're wasting it, right? Like you have to always be working to fulfill your potential. And, after a while, you start asking, what is this potential? I've never seen, but, it's not a thing that you can point to. That brings us to worthiness. And I would like to get into why you chose this as a topic, but I'd love to start with what is worthiness?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I see sort of worthiness, self-worth, specifically as the way you see yourself, treat yourself, and feel about yourself. So really, it's about your relationship with yourself. And I argue that your relationship with yourself is the most important relationship in your life. It is the only relationship you will always have, right? You cannot get out of it. And I think it's our most neglected relationship. So the core of our self-worth is just how do we show up for ourselves? Are we beating ourselves up all the time? Are we criticizing ourselves? Are we judging ourselves? Are we putting ourselves down, right? Lots of negative self-talk. Or are we encouraging? Are we supportive? Are we affirming? So that's sort of how I think about self-worth and what goes into it and what it looks like. And then this piece of how I got there. So, I sort of left off my story where I was getting into graduate school, and getting into graduate school, starting a PhD program right after college wasn't enough again. And so I decided very early in my PhD program that I needed to finish in 5 years, right? The average time to finish was like 6 to 7 years, but I had to finish in 5, right? Like another way to prove that I was worthy. And I think some of that also came from like, I wanted a break because I had gone straight through. And so I just made myself, I was already sort of anxious, right? But I really took it over the edge with rushing through and really trying to finish as quickly as possible. So finally ended up going to therapy and, started slowing down. And then things really came to a head for me when I didn't graduate in 5 years because I just was going to make myself sick trying to do that. So I slowed down and I defended my dissertation. I'm 6 years in. And I passed my dissertation defense, walked out, started sobbing. So upset because that also did not make me feel worthy. That was the last thing that I thought, if I do this thing, I'll feel worthy. And so, of course, at the time, I didn't have the insight to know, oh, this is a self-worth issue that I'm having, and I really got to work on my self-worth. But over time, right, like that really pushed me to start figuring out there's something inside of me that has to shift because this achievement thing isn't working. Like I've tried it for a long time and it's not working for me. So I started to look inward, started to try to figure out like what is going to make me feel more whole. And, did a lot of reading and listening to spiritual talks and therapy and all of those things. I sort of was getting at it myself without labeling it. And then I worked at the University of Chicago in their counseling center for 4 years. And UChicago, I think, is the number 4 school in the US. So it's very like top tier school, incredibly high achieving intellectual students. And what I was finding as I was working as a therapist there, that they were struggling with very similar things that I was struggling with. So on the outside, it looked like you got it together. You got into this amazing school. You're really smart. You have everything going for you. But on the inside, you're really struggling. You do not feel good enough. You're struggling with depression. You're struggling with anxiety. And so it was a combination of the insight and the wisdom I gained from my own experience, as well as what I was seeing in the students that I was working with, that really helped me to ground into this idea of self-worth. It's like, it's not a self-esteem issue, right? Like many of these students are confident in their abilities. It's a self-worth issue. It's something deeper. It's the challenge with believing that despite all of the external things, you're still worthy.
Yeah. I think it's worth unpacking that distinction between self-worth and self-esteem. Help us understand how they're different and how to kind of geolocate the self-worth as apart from the self-esteem.
Yeah. So I think of self-esteem as being sort of outward facing and self-worth as being inward. So self-esteem is your abilities, your accomplishments, and the things that you believe you can achieve, right? So it's like what you do in the world, right? Like, oh, I'm a really good designer or therapist or coach or activist, or, you know what I mean? Like, I know that I can do things that make a difference, right? That's often where self-esteem lands, and we can have high self-esteem because, we feel confident. I know how to tackle these problems. I know how to help these people in this way, right? I've done it enough that I feel confident. I have high self-esteem in doing those things. And then self-worth is more of this internal. How do I treat myself? So sometimes we have high self-esteem, but in the process of working towards a goal, we really beat ourselves up. We neglect our rest, our nourishment. We treat ourselves poorly. We criticize ourselves with any mistake. We discourage ourselves and say, I don't know if you're going to do it. I don't think you can do it, right? Like there's this sort of this internal self-worth challenge going on even when we're sort of externally showing up and doing the work that we feel confident on some level we can do. And then the other piece is, even when you're not achieving, right? So let's say you get sick and you can't do your work, or you really need to rest, and so you're not working. Or if you have a failure, right? Like, can you still know that you are worthy of love, care, and respect just because you're human? And that's kind of my definition of unconditional self-worth, is believing you deserve to be alive, to be loved and cared for, and take up space just because you're human. And so often high achievers have high self-esteem, right? They have confidence that they can do the job and do the job well. But the way they treat themselves in the process and how they feel about themselves if something does not go right, if they lose a job or whatever, is indicative of their self-worth.
This worthiness thing I discovered in the last maybe couple of years. I think initially through Brene Brown and then through some research. And it feels almost like a hack or like magic, because it's like you're doing something so small, like forgiving yourself or accepting yourself. And it feels so small in the moment, but it has such big effects in the rest of your life. But to play devil's advocate, why is worthiness important?
It's a good question. I love your phrasing of it as a hack. That feels very like tech world. I'm like, ooh, that's cool.
Yeah.
You're right. Cause it's like a shortcut. It's like, oh, like they're gonna go better if you're kind to yourself. Why is it important? So when we don't believe that we're worthy, or we believe our worth is conditioned on meeting certain goals or achievements, etc., we are usually oriented towards proving that we are worthy. Our self-worth depends on us doing things perfectly, right? So we started with a conversation about perfectionism. So if you don't believe you're worthy, you're more likely to be caught up in like, I got to get everything right. I've got to do everything. And so sometimes that looks like overworking, right? Like maybe if I'm just constantly working and constantly productive, then I'm worthy. Sometimes it can look like procrastination. It's too overwhelming to start because my worth depends on it. Because if I don't do this right, if I don't do this perfectly, that means I don't belong here. I don't have anything to contribute. I'm not good enough. I'm going to beat myself up. Nobody will love and care about me, etc. And so I'm going to put it off until the last minute because I'm overwhelmed about starting. I'm anxious about starting, right? First, you're anxious about starting, so you procrastinate. Then your anxiety about not doing it kicks in. So then you rush and you do it. And then you overwork, right? Because you got to work 24/7 to meet the deadline. And then you feel frustrated because you probably didn't do your best work. And then you're exhausted. So you got to take a break. But the next deadline's coming up. So you procrastinate, right? So we can kind of get caught in this cycle. But if we, in contrast, are grounded in our worthiness, we work not from a space of desperation, but a space of, I'm excited to show up and share my gifts, not to prove that I'm worthy, but because I know I have something that's meaningful, that I can contribute, and because that feels good. There's a sense of my contribution to the world and the value that I bring to the world is not just about what I do, but it's also about, I like to say, who I be, right? It's the energy I bring. It's the attention I bring, right? It's the presence that I bring. And I think we all have that experience of being in someone's presence or working with someone who it's not just about what they do, it's also about how they are with us. That's really impactful. And so when we're grounded in our worthiness, we can move from that space. And I actually think we're more powerful, we're more effective, we're more efficient, and we also take care of ourselves and have more fun in the process because it's not about performing perfection and getting everything right. It's about playing and learning and growing and developing and coping and riding the waves of the challenges as well.
That's beautiful. And is it true that you associate low self-worth and the pervasiveness of low self-worth with the rise of depression and anxiety? And is that something that's getting worse rather than better?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't think that self-worth is the only cause of those things, right? I think there's a lot of things that contribute to the rise of depression and anxiety. And we know that there is a significant increase in depression and anxiety, especially since the start of the pandemic. I had some stats on this because I did a talk a little while ago, which I can't remember, but it's like 25% increase, 30% increase in anxiety and depression. People are really stressed. And, some of that with COVID is isolation, loss, all of those things. And I also think that when we have a sense of worthiness that's based on work and you can't work, or when you have a sense of worthiness that's based on being out and about and traveling and showing yourself to look good and whatever, and you can't do that, there's this emptiness. It's like, well, who am I if I'm not going out and doing these things, right? Who am I if I can only be at home? And so I also think that we more and more in society are focused on what you produce, how you look, the attention you get as barometers of worthiness. And so as that becomes more of how we see people and how we judge people, it's harder for people to feel grounded in their sense of worthiness. And it makes people feel more anxious and stressed when they don't fit into these molds of what society says is worthy, right? You look a certain way, you have a certain amount of money, you communicate a certain way, you have a certain type of job, right? And most of us don't fit into that. And so that can leave us feeling unworthy if we adopt society standards.
Yeah. And it seems like it's also connected to the rise of social media and the kind of shallowness of how our relationships are mediated by these platforms that have an advertiser incentive to just get us to stay and see, and in the same way kind of use ego and use vanity to pull us in, and then it seems like a pretty shallow loop. And is there any sense that younger people and people who grew up with social media are more affected by this?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are. And I think I'm not intimately familiar with the research, but my sort of like cursory understanding is that the research shows that they are. I think that's why we're seeing more anxiety and depression among teenagers and young people than ever before. I think the thing that makes me the saddest is young people are developing their understanding of how to connect and communicate very much with apps. And from what I understand, this is impeding their ability to connect without texting, without messaging, without apps. And so then what you'll see is young people are together and everybody's on their phone, right? You see that with adults too. It changes our way of communicating normally. And in some ways, if you're not with someone physically, that can be helpful because it's nice to be able to text or send a DM or whatever. But then when you're in person, we've developed these habits and a sort of addictions, as you're mentioning, right? These apps are designed to capture our attention. And so we've developed that such that even when we're in person, there is a pull to be on our phones and scrolling, which then disrupts connection, right? If you are on your phone and not looking at the person in front of you, or even if you are so caught up in, I've got to get the perfect picture, I've got to get the perfect video, and then post it right away. And then I'm going to see what they're saying about this video of me with my friends, right? We look like we're having fun, but we're really on our phones, right? All of that interrupts being present, being engaged. And it's really hard to have a deep, thoughtful conversation when you're scrolling, right? Like your attention is just not there. And so we miss these opportunities to feel deeply connected, to feel like we belong, to feel, right? Like that feeling of, oh, such a good conversation with one of your best friends. It's like, you don't have those as often. And so I certainly think that contributes to feelings of loneliness and isolation. And that contributes to anxiety and depression and can cause us to feel less worthy as well.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. I feel like an old man sometimes when I say this, but when I look at like the selfie culture and it's literally like people seeming to not have fun at all, but then posing for very like happy faces for like a selfie and then go back to like not having fun. And is that something that someone with a sense of worthiness would do to themselves, or would they focus on how they're actually feeling in that moment and try to improve that? And so I guess the obvious question is, now that we know that worthiness is important and how it affects, how do I get some? You have a process in place. So talk about that in a little bit.
So I'm going to share it in this way. So one, I think the core of it is building a healthy relationship with yourself, thinking about how you treat yourself, how you see yourself, how you show up for yourself. And I've developed a framework that I talk about to sort of orient around 3 core areas that people can start to think about to get to a place where they're embracing their self-worth. And so the three areas are freeing yourself, loving yourself, and being yourself. And so the freeing yourself is about letting go of past things, mistakes, burdens, failures, traumas that are keeping you attached to a story that you are not worthy. Because many of us have something, right? I know I certainly have had many things where I have decided that because I did this or because this happened to me, I am not worthy, right? And so we sort of believe that story as though it's true. And one of the pieces that we need to do is release that story. And sometimes that looks like forgiving ourselves. Sometimes that looks like releasing and challenging the conditions that we've placed on our worth and getting really honest about where those conditions came from in the first place. Like, are you adopting racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, transphobic? Like, are you adopting societal views and conditions and putting those on your worth? And like, how can you release those? Then we have loving yourself, which is really about like, how do you start pouring into yourself, right? And loving less as a feeling, although it's great to have the feeling, and more as action, right? Can you offer yourself kindness and compassion? Can you show up for yourself and be there for yourself in a way that a friend would be there for you? With encouragement, can you drop the self-criticism, right? Or at least stop believing it? You know, can you offer yourself this love and take care of yourself? And then the third component is the be yourself, which is really about tapping into your internal wisdom. What are your values that are important to you, and how do you want those to guide your life? How do you begin to trust yourself again? Instead of trusting more in the world and what the world says about you, can you trust in your own internal wisdom and intuition and use that as your guide for showing up and shining and sharing your gifts with the world? And then also, how do you be in relationship with people so that you can receive love, right? And believe that you're worthy of it.
I think that the last part of being yourself is so interesting. And this is some of the stuff that I've experienced, maybe even just in the past year, where I started taking a lot more risks, professional risks and personal risks. And I think it all came from kind of this feeling of why not? Like, this is something that I would like to do. Or are there any, because you have this beautiful quote in your talk where you say, what would you have the courage to do if you knew you were worthy? So give me some examples, if you can, of things that people do when they start with assuming that they're worthy.
Yeah. Maybe I'll share some examples from my own life. Well, maybe I'll do one personal, one couple work related. So one work related is when my last job, so I work for myself now, but in my last job, right, like speaking up in a leadership committee meeting, right? Like there's a leadership committee meeting and there was a conversation about rioting that was happening or looting that was happening. It was looting. And I was just like, oh, you know, I'm a Black woman. For those people listening, I'm an American Black woman and I live in Chicago. And I just like queasy feeling. And, you know, the CEO and some other leadership people were like, oh my gosh, like my downtown building, there was something that happened. You know, it's just like something minor that happened to the glass in the store on the first floor. And I live on the 15th, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, like I'm not cool with this, right? I spoke up in a way that was risky, right? Like it was risky for me to say something and I was one of the people in the leadership team who had the least power, but I said something. And part of what helped me to say something was believing that even if they don't like what I say, even if I don't say it perfectly, I'm worthy and I don't need their approval. I don't need the CEO to approve of me to know that I'm worthy. I know I'm worthy. I know I make a contribution. And in the extreme, like let's say I get fired. I didn't think I was going to get fired, but like I know I'm still worthy. And I also know that I have the tools and the practices to show up for myself and with myself if something challenging or difficult came from me speaking up. So that's one example, is that it gives you courage, right? Like the question is, what would you have the courage to do, right? To speak your truth, to share and to advocate in a way that's powerful. I think another thing for me is I left that job. It wasn't a great fit. I was kind of miserable. And I had spent my life being affiliated with prestigious institutions, educational institutions. That was a safety place for me, right? It was impressive, and people could then think positively about me. And you might say that it could make me more worthy because I was affiliated with this organization or that institution. And I decided I'm going to go out on my own, right? Like I'm going to leave all affiliation and I am going to start my own business, right? Yeah. And I know that believing that I'm worthy allowed me to do that. And the magic of it is I now work less, I have more of an impact, I do more of what I love, and I make more money, right? But if I didn't feel worthy in myself, I wouldn't have been able to trust myself enough to take that leap of faith and then build something that I think is really powerful from a space where I'm grounded in my worthiness. I don't need to prove to the world that I'm worthy through my business. I want to share my gifts and show up and help people.
Yeah, and starting a business is always very scary, especially when you haven't done it before and you're stepping into it. It's not easy. So you said you were a type A person. I don't know if you still would define yourself as a type A person.
Probably, yeah.
Okay. And I think probably me too. But my question is, how do you know when you're doing something for worthiness versus for self-expression, when sometimes they're one and the same in a way? You know, so I'm doing some things that are pretty risky. Most people would probably not do professionally. Probably have a lot of both like self-expression and the kind of bravery that is about, you know, being yourself, but also some status. And, you know, and so how do I look inside myself and how do I balance, you know, appropriate achievement with something that's, you know, feels unhealthy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have a couple of thoughts. So one is, I think that it's probably, as you're sort of alluding to, it's probably hard to perfectly disentangle, right? And say like, this is grounded in my worthiness and this is achievement. It's probably hard to put things in boxes. Some will be obviously one and some will be obviously another. Like for me, pursuing academia, when I look back at it, it was like very much prove my worth more than I really just love this. And there were things in it that I did love, right? So it usually is complicated. But I think kind of thinking about if I don't succeed, will I still feel like this was worth the try, worth the effort, worth the energy? Can I still find value in the process and the experience versus being so outcome oriented? Because usually when we're really, really caught up in the outcome, that tends to be a prove your worth kind of thing. And when we can focus on, appreciate, enjoy the process, usually that kind of helps us with orienting around the being and the experience and less of the performance, the performative aspects. Also, like, what if nobody knew what you were doing? What if it had a really big impact, but like you never got that 40 under 40 or Forbes list, you know, like, would it be that you felt maybe a little disappointed, right? Like it's fine to be like, man, I wish this was recognized. Or would it be like devastating and feel like, well, that was a waste of time, you know?
No, I think those are wonderful. And then that actually makes me feel good about my decisions because I think I passed those two tests. But wonderful. So one thing that I'm feeling a lot these days, but you know, maybe not in a sinister way, is imposter syndrome. Doing something that's brand new and feeling like, you know, looking at the other people around me and feeling like they know a lot more than I do. But in my case, it's absolutely true. There's no question that everybody around me knows more than I do about this because I just walked into a room where I've never been before. How does imposter syndrome relate to worthiness? And is there a healthy way? Because I think Adam Grant talks about him like having a little bit of imposter syndrome is a good thing because it keeps you open-minded.
Yeah, I think I've seen Adam Grant's stance on that, and I don't agree with him. I mean, so my understanding, definition that I've read of imposter syndrome is feeling like a fake or fraud despite evidence of high achievement. It's the sense that you don't have anything to contribute, that you're not good enough, that you don't deserve to be there, right? And I think that's different than humility. I think it's different than openness. I think it's different than a willingness to learn. And in fact, I think imposter syndrome can impede those things. Because if you feel like you're a fake or a fraud, right? Like those are strong words, right? It's different than like, woof, I've got a lot to learn. Like I know the least in the room. So let me listen. Let me be curious. Let me ask questions, right? That stance isn't a stance of if they find me out, they're going to kick me out. Right? It's a stance of I'm so grateful to be here and I have so much to learn. So I am going to humble myself. I'm going to be curious. I'm going to ask so many questions. I'm going to do research. That is a different stance, right? And so I think part of the challenge is people confuse imposter syndrome with humility. And they think I have to feel like an imposter to be humble because there's this sort of extreme. If you're not an imposter, you're arrogant and you think you know everything. And it's like, well, no, that's not true.
So how does spirituality or religion connect with all of this? And I noticed you've done an episode about that on your podcast. Are there some really fundamental beliefs that shape how we approach this subject?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the religion, the spirituality, the cultural norms that we grow up with shape us. I grew up Christian. My dad's a minister. And at least in the sect part of Christianity that I grew up in, there was definitely a sense of I'm not worthy, right? Like you're not worthy. Jesus died for your sins, but you're not worthy of it. You're a sinner. You're not, right? Like those were like messages and themes. And I didn't go to like a hellfire and brimstone type of church that was always talking about sin, but there was a sense of like, we humans are not worthy. And that's why you needed Jesus to die on the cross for you to save you from your sins. Not all Christians believe that, but I certainly think that created a sense of I am not worthy, right? I'm not good enough. These mistakes, these sins make me not worthy. And so that was my angle towards it. I think there are other people who are Christians or from other religions who ground their worthiness in their belief in a higher power and their belief in the relationship they have with a higher power. So I'm not trying to say that like all Christians believe what I believe, but that was just how I came about it. And there are some people who their sense of faith is like, this is what, like, I know I'm worthy because I'm divinely created, because I have a relationship with the divine. And there are other people, and this is sort of where I land now, which is like the divine is within. It's not separate. It's not out there somewhere. It's in me. It's in everyone, right? And that very much connects to my own sense of worthiness and my sense that everybody is worthy. So I think that to me, if you're struggling with self-worth and you have some religious or spiritual belief, it's worth sort of interrogating or at least being curious about the messages that you have received implicitly, explicitly, that you've decided to believe, and how that informs your sense of worthiness or unworthiness, and sort of figuring out, like, do you want to continue with those beliefs? Do you want to hold on to them? Are they helpful? Are they unhelpful? I like using the phrases helpful, unhelpful versus good or bad. And then exploring, like, if it feels unhelpful, could you try on something different? Are there other parts of the religious text that say something a little bit different about who you are and that truth that you might hold on to instead of this text that may be more about sin and wrongdoing or whatever? And so I think, unfortunately, some faiths say don't ask questions, right? And I think that's a challenging stance. But if you're willing, can you explore how this interacts for you and your sense of worthiness and whether there's a different way to approach it, even within your faith and spirituality?
Yeah, that's so interesting. And this is a topic that goes deep with people. One of the things that I found most beautiful in your talk is just the idea of basing your self-worth on the fact that we're human, which implies that every human has basic self-worth, which connects with beautiful ideas of human dignity, universal human dignity. And in a way, it also feels like a very political statement because it feels like around the world today, there the real argument is between people who think that everyone has dignity and the people who think that some people do not have dignity or should not have dignity or are not willing to extend dignity to everyone. And so that brings me to, I heard you writing another book, or I've written, but I've not published yet. Tell me about that project.
Yeah, so it's a little different, and I love the phrase human dignity. I think I'm gonna hold that one. I like that a lot. So the project's a little bit different. It's really emerges from my work with Black women in therapy, and so it's a book that I've co-authored, and it's about Black women's mental health, and it's aimed at practitioners and people who work with Black women to help them understand the context, the experiences, the history that many Black, mostly African-American women experience, or I'd say Black women in the US probably experience, and what those challenges look like. I think in all of my work, I take sort of a strengths-based approach, which is at the core, it's like, there's nothing wrong with you, right? I think in everything that I do, whether it's this upcoming book, it's like, and when I say there's nothing wrong with you, it doesn't mean that there's nothing to be healed, there's nothing to grow, nothing to evolve, but it's pushing back against the oh wow, I'm not getting that word right. Pathologizing. Yeah, there we go. That's the way to say it. Pathologizing people. And I think historically, Black people in the US have been pathologized, right? There's something wrong with you. And it's a very individualistic way of looking at mental health and challenges versus look at the society you're living in, right? If you're navigating racism and sexism and all these other isms, if you're navigating economic disparities, that's what creates these challenges that then you see that come out through as mental health. And so I think particularly in the mental health field, we need to understand the context, and we tend to focus a little bit too much on the individual. If I'm going to connect this book that's forthcoming, it should come out first half of 2023. Right. And my work around self-worth, it's around how do we affirm that there's nothing wrong with Black women? Yes, there's healing. Yes, there's support. All of those things can be offered and can be worked through, but it's not that there's something inherently wrong with them. And it's really important for those who are supporting them to understand that.
Yeah, that's a great message. So this is our closing question. It's always the same. In his TED Talk, Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being kind of a dry, modern way of delivering information where, I just give you a little bit of information and you make up your own mind. And a sermon being an urgent plea to change someone's life for the better. And he kind of longs for the days of sermons. He thinks we should have more sermons. And so my question to you is, if you could give a short sermon to the world, what would it be about?
I think it would be about why. So it would be something like, you are worthy, and it's so important for you to know this because the world needs you. I deeply believe that the world will be a better place when everyone knows they're worthy and can show up and share their gifts. Because I think there's room for that. I think that we need everyone's contribution. And I think the more people who claim the truth of who they are, which is worthy, it's not better than, it's not more important than, it's worthy and worthy of contributing, worthy of being cared and loved for, and then moving from that space, that will change the world. I deeply believe that. And I think that we're in a space in this world where people are struggling with that. People feel like, I'm worthy if I put you down and everybody in this group down. And it's getting scary, right? We are seeing the violence that results from people believing that in order to be worthy, in order to maintain power, they must smash out other people. It's dangerous, right? We've seen it throughout history. We see it now. And so my sermon is that you got to get on the worthy train. You got to start treating yourself well, because that is the foundation for treating other people with care and love and respect, not from a place of desperation, but a place of knowing the truth of who you are and believing that truth about other people and coming together to create this world that we all really want. That's for everyone. It's not just for some people. It's not just these people have to be in power, but it's for everyone.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Adia.
Thank you. These were such wonderful, thought-provoking questions. And we are virtual, but I feel the connection and the thoughtfulness. And I appreciate you asking such insightful questions and inviting me on the show.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.